You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Gay men are often seen as being pretty sexually open-minded and uninhibited when it comes to sex. However, when it comes to the topic of sexual fantasies, they're just like everyone else in the sense that many of them feel a lot of shame regarding what it is that turns them on. So in today's show, we're going to be diving into the topic of gay men's sexual fantasies. We're going to discuss common things that gay guys fantasize about and why a lot of them feel conflicted about their fantasies. It turns out that gay men on average have more fantasies about taboo and kinky activities, so we'll explore why that might be. We'll also talk about the deeper psychology behind their fantasies and what it means when things like a previous trauma become a part of one's fantasies. We'll also talk about how porn shapes gay men's fantasies and what you need to know if you feel ashamed of your desires and turn-ons. My guest is Dr. Joe Court, the clinical director and founder of the Center for Relationship and Sexual Health in Royal Oak, Michigan. He is a board-certified clinical sexologist and the author of multiple books, including Cracking the Code, Helping Gay Men Understand Their Fantasies. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Hi, Joe, and welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Justin.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. All right, so we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics today, which is sexual fantasies. And you've actually published a whole book on gay men's fantasies specifically. So that's what we're going to focus on. Now, as a starting point, what led you to write a whole book on this topic?
Well, I had my own therapy from a therapist who was not a sexual health therapist. She was a sexual trauma therapist. And when I sat down with her, she said, for me to help you for my own trauma, you're going to have to tell me all about your fantasies. And then we're going to do your family history and we're going to connect the dots. It was shocking to me, but positively surprising how many things related to my childhood.
Thanks for sharing that. So I think one of the things that people often get wrong about fantasies is in terms of what their fantasies represent. Now, you mentioned that you could connect the dots to a lot of things. And, sometimes our fantasies do have deeper meaning like that, but sometimes they don't necessarily have deeper meaning. One of the things that some people get worried about with their fantasies is that if you have a fantasy about something, it necessarily means that it's something that you actually want to do in real life. Or if your partner tells you a fantasy, there's this assumption that your partner wants you to try this with them. And other people tend to think that, well, I have this fantasy about this really deviant thing, therefore it must mean that there's something wrong with me, that I have a mental illness, or, why would I be into something that's like that? So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about what fantasies actually represent and how we should think about them.
Yeah, I just had a client leave with this exact same topic. And I said to him, yes, you get into whatever his kink was. I said, but it doesn't mean you're going to go outside my office and say to somebody who you find attractive, could you do this to me right now? I want you to, humiliate me or, spit on me or something. Like, he said, no, I would never do that. But maybe in bed, it might be something that arouses you because, as Esther Perel says, and I think you say it too, it's politically incorrect. It goes against what you would want in your real life. And that makes it super spicy. And I like people to understand that because literally, who would want this to happen to you? But metaphorically and erotically, it's very arousing.
Yeah, and I think that's so true that when it comes to fantasies, it's often these things that are politically incorrect that turn us on. And you're right that it does add this spicy element to it. And sometimes this is a thing that people do actually like to play with in bed because it does give it that extra kick, or it is something they're really interested in. But other times it's just sort of fodder in our fantasies. It's something to think about that we don't necessarily want to do in real life. And so for that reason, I think it's really important to distinguish between a sexual fantasy and a sexual desire, with a fantasy just being the mental thought that turns you on and the desire being the thing that you actually want to do. And for some people, there's a lot more overlap between fantasy and desire than others. And for some people, they're just totally separate things. And sometimes it's a fantasy about something that would be totally impossible to actually do in real life. And so it might just be a fantasy for that reason.
What I like to do is help people. That's why I wrote, you're talking about the book, Cracking the Erotic Code, that I wrote for gay men. And I did it because I wanted people to have erotic compassion for themselves, right? For them to say, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. This comes from somewhere. And like you said, it doesn't always. It might be that I discovered it at the time in my childhood. It wasn't something that was shaped. But either way, why not allow yourself to enjoy something pleasurable, even if it comes from something that may have been traumatic for you?
Right. Now, you titled the book Cracking the Erotic Code. So I wondered if you could tell us, what is the erotic code?
So I always say this, you have a sexual orientation and an erotic orientation. Your sexual orientation is to whom you're attracted. Your erotic orientation are the things that get you off, the things that, bring you to orgasm. So the erotic code is whatever it is for you. What is it that turns you on? Like from the Jack Morin's book, The Erotic Mind, changed my life. And that's really what I borrowed a lot from, is if you can understand the metaphors, like interpreting a dream, right? And really looking at the core erotic theme of what turns you on, that's your code.
Yeah, your core erotic theme, I think, is a good way to put it. And we all have one. It's just we aren't necessarily always aware of it. And I think that's what you try and do in your book, is try to get people to really understand what their core erotic theme is, because that's where our fantasies originate from, right? It can tell us kind of if there is a deeper meaning behind them and how to put those pieces together. Let's dive into gay men's fantasies. So in your work, what have you found with regard to maybe what are some of the common themes that appear in the fantasies of gay men?
Oh, so many, the whole idea of turning a straight guy, right? Getting him to want you and to be with you. A lot of power dynamic, power exchange with other gay men. Cuckolding is a big one. It never used to be. I'm telling you, it's really changed. Maybe you probably know this too. It's changed over time, but it's really big and huge, and people like that. And a lot of the fantasies are imagining really big penises. That's a really big turn on for a lot of, these are the common ones,
And what about some of maybe the less common ones, things that might surprise people, or that, might even be surprising to the people that have them, where they come up to you in your therapy office and say, why am I fantasizing about this? What does it mean?
Yeah. By the way, another common one I forgot was breeding, being bred and being impregnated. There's like a big fantasy for, but the less common ones would be the feminizing ones, where they want to be feminized. In my generation, I didn't hear much about that at all. I'm hearing more from the younger generation. The less common ones would be small penis humiliation kind of thing, where they don't talk about that kind of stuff. And so many of these guys don't even have small penises. It's just the fantasy of having one. And this is not as much talked about, but the whole financial domination, FinDom, is another one.
So it is interesting that in gay men's fantasies, when it comes to the topic of penis size, it's often at the extremes, right? It's either fetishization of these very large penises, or it's, being humiliated for having a really small penis. And it's sort of like, where are the average penises represented in these fantasies? Because it's usually kind of at one of those two extremes.
That's such a great question. I never thought about it, but it's a great question.
It's interesting, and I think it reflects our just general obsession with penis size in a lot of different ways. But in terms of my own work, I've studied the fantasies of gay men too, and I see a lot of kink themes that come up for this group. Everything on the kink spectrum tends to be more common among gay men, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But I think, to your point about the feminization fantasies, I see that as well with, kind of gender play as this broader category of fantasies does tend to be more common for younger adults. And I think that's because younger people today have more expansive ideas about gender. And so maybe that sort of opens the door to playing with that taboo theme a little bit more. Now, something that I talk about in my book, Tell Me What You Want, is that, our fantasies are often reflective of these deeper underlying needs. They're not just about sex or pleasure. There's often this emotional subtext to them, and they can represent ways that we're kind of grappling with core issues. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the psychological needs that might be showing up in gay men's fantasies. I'm thinking about things like power, validation, belonging, masculinity, but curious to hear your thoughts here in terms of like, what is the emotional subtext that might be showing up or popping up in gay men's fantasies?
I think a lot of the younger guys, they're into the daddy fantasy. They're into wanting to have maturity and they're eroticizing that and security. And really, I think a lot of them are unfathered. And people will say, well, then they have daddy issues. Well, so what? We all have some daddy or mommy issues and it gets eroticized. It doesn't have to mean there's something wrong with them. And some of them, I think the whole masculinity that we're taught, we're not masculine enough. We're not in the right fraternity of heterosexuality, heteronormativity. So they are looking for something that they feel isn't a part of them. It's like a lost part of themselves.
Yeah, this has me thinking about some of the questions I asked on my survey, where I asked people how they see themselves in their own fantasies and if they're changing themselves in any way. And one of the things I found was that gay men change themselves in their fantasies a heck of a lot more than straight men do. And they change themselves even more than women of different sexual orientations do as well. So they're more likely to change their body, to change their penis size, to change their personality. And I think that this is reflective of like deeper cultural pressures on gay men to fit certain masculine ideals in terms of maybe what their body looks like or their penis size or their personality or approach. And I think oftentimes we're shifting and changing ourselves in our fantasies to be this version of ourselves that maybe we feel more comfortable with, because maybe that kind of puts a lid on some of the anxiety and allows us to kind of relax and be in the moment and enjoy the experience. But I was curious if you've seen that as well, where gay men are often sort of changing their self-presentation in their fantasies, maybe as a way of coping with some of that anxiety.
I do, and I remember reading that in your book, and I feel like I'm seeing it more as we become more masculinized in our community. It feels similar to straight men will do this, right? Well, they will allow themselves to be more feminine in their fantasies and in the bedroom, but never present. It's almost coming together at the same time. I'll tell you what I also see is a lot of gay men are so clingy to what they believe in and how they want to see themselves that they don't allow themselves, their erotic orientation, to evolve. Like, for instance, I used to be into older daddy guys always, and my husband wasn't. He was into more twinky, younger, and I used to make fun of him all the time. And I woke up at 50 and I started to become attracted to only twinky, younger guys. And it was an evolution that I embraced, but it was shocking. And I think a lot of gay men resist that.
Yeah, it is so true that our sexuality evolves so much over the lifespan. The things that might turn you on in your fantasies at 20 might look very different at 30 or 40 or 50 or beyond. I think there's this whole developmental life course to our fantasies. And it makes sense, because if fantasies are reflecting some of these deeper underlying needs that we have, well, we're going to have different needs at different stages of life. And so I think that fantasies in a lot of ways are just kind of reflective of where we are at this moment in time. And we need to be open to the fact that our fantasies are going to shift and change and evolve. Sometimes the things that used to turn you on no longer do, and that's okay. But I think people sometimes think, oh, there must be something wrong with me. Like, why isn't this doing it for me anymore? And it's because, well, you might just be a different sexual person now, and that's okay. So when you're talking about things like your core erotic themes, well, those things change and shift over time. We're constantly evolving as sexual beings. But going back to something that I saw in some of the research on gay men's fantasies, I found that gay men in general have more taboo and kinky fantasies than their heterosexual counterparts. And one theory behind this is that perhaps if you're a sexual minority, you've already transgressed a lot of social norms about sex. So maybe that just opens the door to exploring your sexuality more, or maybe it makes it less costly to violate other norms. But I wanted to ask for your thoughts on this. Why do you think taboo themes are so prevalent in gay men's fantasies?
I think what you just said makes total sense. And I think it does come from how we're socialized and burying and oppressing ourselves. And, already just mainstream growing up male, don't spit there, don't talk like that, don't walk like that. And then on top of that, you have the whole suppressing your whole gay identity. So I see it. Like, I've been to IML, right? And when you go to IML, there's such a international Mr. Leather contest in Chicago, such a robust outpour of all kinds of fantasies, human ashtrays, puppy play, we can go on. And it's all about breaking the rules, right? We had to be rule followers growing up. So I think there's something erotic about breaking the rules in our fantasies.
Yeah. And I think too, there could also be some reverse causality explanation here, such that maybe people who are into more taboo or kinky things to begin with are more likely to acknowledge that they have same-sex attractions, right? It's not to say that if you're into taboo things that makes you gay, but rather that it might make you more willing or open to acknowledging different aspects of your sexuality and labeling them. So it's probably a bi-directional thing here, but we do see not just in fantasies, but also in real life, this higher prevalence of kink, and also this, if you think about gay pride events, there's often this celebration of kink that happens, but that's also become controversial in recent years as pride has become more family friendly. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yes, it has.
Hey guys, if you're looking for more confidence in the bedroom or just want to improve your performance, you need to know about FirmTech because they're changing the game. When you've tracked 136,000 erections like they have, you learn a lot, and FirmTech is using that data to transform men's sexual health. Here's the deal, most ED treatment is still trial and error. It's guesswork. But FirmTech's Tech Ring changes that by giving you and your doctor real data, how firm you're getting, how long you're staying there, whether your meds are working, and whether pumps, PRP, or shockwave therapy are likely to do anything for you. It can even help optimize your dosing of ED meds, backed by actual science. But what I love most is this. The Tech Ring doesn't just measure erections, it improves them. Its design helps keep more blood in the penis, which means harder erections, more staying power, and more intense orgasms. FirmTech's database also uncovered something big. For most guys, fading erections aren't dysfunction, they're venous leak. That means you can get hard, but blood just doesn't stay in the penis. It starts leaving before you want it to. The Tech Ring picks that up early, long before you consciously notice anything. It can even flag cardiovascular-related ED, which is the kind that you don't want to ignore. The bottom line is this. Every man is somewhere on the spectrum from erectile fitness to erectile dysfunction. FirmTech gives you the tools and the data to stop, slow, or even reverse that trend. Check the show notes for the link and save 15% off your FirmTech order with code Justin15. Stay fit, stay firm. Let's talk about low libido. If you've ever looked for a supplement in the hopes of giving yours a little boost, you know what a minefield it can be. There are so many options, and some of them contain really questionable ingredients. It's a market that's notorious for products that are underdosed, ineffective, or in some cases, just downright shady. That's why I'm excited to tell you about Drive Boost from VB Health. VB Health has changed the game by focusing on what truly matters: trust and transparency. Imagine a libido supplement formulated by doctors, one that's rigorously third-party tested for purity and potency so you know exactly what you're getting. And it's made with care in the USA. That's Drive Boost. This supplement is also unique because it's formulated for both men and women. So if you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a libido supplement that's effective and that you can feel confident about, it's time to check out Drive Boost. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin to get 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. Now, research finds that gay men watch even more porn than heterosexual men do. And we know that porn can and does shape our sexuality in some ways. So I'm curious for your take on how you think porn might be influencing the fantasies of gay men.
I think it helps us evolve our fantasies, and I think it helps normalize the things that we're into. Wow, if this is being made in film or in literature, then other people are into it. I also wonder how much of the fact that we do it, we look at it more because heterosexual men are monitored by their female partners. And so they may not look at it as much, or they're hiding it and they're not talking about it, because I see a lot of heterosexual couples in my practice and the monitoring is off the chart, where in gay male couples, it's not like that.
Yeah, I think that is really true. And it's a good point that porn is less likely to be a source of conflict in gay male relationships because it's just more kind of normalized and accepted that people are going to watch porn, and they might also use it together as a form of erotic enjoyment. And while porn can serve as a way to explore your sexuality, I think there also can be a darker side to it in terms of some of the ideas that it reinforces about what it means to be gay or to have gay sex, right? And so I'm thinking about, for example, going back to our earlier discussion about penis size, one of the things I see is that the more porn people watch, the larger the penises are that they tend to fantasize about, right? So it might sort of reinforce these ideas that penises are supposed to be or look a certain way or be a certain size. And I think too, in the world of gay porn, there tends to be relatively narrow depictions of how sex is presented, and that everybody is either a top or a bottom. But as you discussed previously when you were on my show, you talked about how some gay men are sides and they're not into anal sex. And so I just wondered if you could speak to that point too, about how porn can kind of give us sometimes a limited idea about what sex is and might constrain us in certain ways.
Yeah, I think it can be very shaming because we think we should have that body, we'd have that penis size. I remember, I think I might have said this on your last show, I would always have to fast forward through the intercourse scenes because I'm not into it, right? Or go past the pages in the magazines. And it's because we don't talk about it. We're not having sex education, obviously. We're certainly not having gay sex education. And nobody's talking about their insecurities. They do in my office and they do when I do retreats or whatever, but we're not talking about it in party spaces or in social spaces. And I think that's what ends up skewing things.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, for LGBTQ people in general, sex ed, traditional sex ed, often just totally leaves them out. Or actually, in some states, it's actually required by law that if you discuss sexual orientation, that you can only discuss it in a negative light. And the result of that is that porn is much more likely to become the default form of sex ed for LGBTQ people. And there are some folks for whom they consider pornography to be a valuable learning source, and it's where they saw validation of their sexuality or their desires or the things that they enjoy. But by the same token, it can also reinforce these certain ideas about what your body is supposed to look like or what you're supposed to do when it comes to sex. And so porn as the default form of sex ed isn't great because it can sort of lead to these sexual scripts that might not reflect what we actually want or the way that our partners want us to approach sex with them. So lots we could say about porn.
Right. And really that it looks like it's with such ease. It isn't with such ease all the time, right? Right. And that's really misleading.
Yeah, there's so much in porn that is left on the cutting room floor, right? That never makes it out onto the screen. And you don't see all of the prep time or when people stop and take a break or anything else like that, or even necessarily in terms of how they negotiate consent or figure out what it is that they want to do in the first place. So what kinds of fantasy-related shame do you see coming up for gay men in your therapy practice? And how do you help them navigate that shame when they feel that deep discomfort about their fantasies?
Well, there's so much of the guys that come through here that talk about liking to be bullied when they were bullied on the playground. Why would I get into something that I hated back then? Wanting to be called faggot, wanting a straight guy to misuse them when in real life or it happened to them, but they would never want to actually happen. There's so much shame. And then they refer to it as internalized homophobia. And I have to work through that. And the belief is if I work through all this, then it's all going to magically go away. And I have to tell them, no, it won't. It may become less compulsive. You'll feel less shame about it. Maybe you won't want to act on it, but you're still going to get off on it. And that's very hard for anybody, not just gay, but it's hard for them because they don't want to. They feel ashamed that something that was so negative for them turns them on.
Yeah, and that's another example of how something that objectively on paper is victimization, but it then turns into this erotic turn on for them. And again, that goes back to what we were saying earlier about how sometimes our fantasies are reflecting these deeper needs and how we're grappling with complex issues. And sometimes the way they do that is by eroticizing them. And we do see that this does sometimes happen in the world of kink, where sometimes people will reenact previous traumas that they endured. And it's actually helpful or therapeutic for them in that context because it's a way of taking control of this previous trauma that they had endured in a situation where they didn't previously have that control, but now they do. And so in that way, it can be kind of empowering as a way to kind of work through that. But by the same token, that doesn't mean they're not going to feel a lot of shame about it, right? Because they're like, why am I turned on by this, right? Because it's easy to see how people can interpret that and say, there must be something wrong with me. But it turns out you're not the only one. Like a heck of a lot of other people are turned on by the same sort of thing.
And sadly, they go to therapists who say there is something wrong with you if you get off on this because they don't understand sexual health the way we do.
Yeah. Are there any specific fantasies that you see gay clients struggling with the most? I know you just gave one example of like that kind of being bullied previously by straight men. Are there other kinds of fantasies you see come up that gay men are often really struggling with or feeling a lot of shame about?
The non-consent. And on TikTok, in social media, they're always trying to get me to talk about non-consent because everybody's wondering about it. And the idea of it gets them off. And, I can't do it on social media. The whole thing will be taken down. But yeah, a lot of people wanting to be controlled or control someone else. And, they misconstrue it as it's a like sex offender kind of behavior when it's just in the fantasy. This is what I love about Jack Moran's and Michael Bader, by the way, his work, which is everybody in the fantasy is turned on. Everybody in the erotic play is turned on. And yeah, you're playing with non-consent. It isn't truly non-consent. That's one thing they grapple with. And then the other thing would be like body fluids, like golden showers. You would think, well, I used to see it a lot in porn. I don't know if it's so much there anymore, but people think, what's wrong with me that I get off on that and want to get peed on or pee on someone else kind of thing.
Yeah. And those are all things that people might feel shame about because, they all fall in that taboo category. And that's something else I see in my research is that the more taboo somebody thinks their fantasy is, the more likely they are to feel ashamed about it. And that's because when they believe their fantasy is taboo, they believe that they're the only one who has it. And when we feel alone in having our fantasies, that's, sort of this breeding ground for feeling a lot of shame and guilt and embarrassment and anxiety about them. But I have one more question for you on this topic of, gay men's sexual fantasies. And it would be, what would be your top 1 or 2 or 3, depending on how many pieces you want to share, but what would be your top pieces of advice for gay men who are feeling ashamed or confused about their fantasies?
I guess first would be to talk to a therapist or an educator or somebody that is trained in sexual health so that you can not just learn that it's common, but get it out. Like with this client I just saw, I tell people, keep talking about it. Look me in the eyes when you talk to me. If you can't do it the first few times, find a way to do it so that you're getting rid of the shame. You're reducing that. I guess the second thing would be to understand that it's okay that it's politically incorrect and it's not appropriate. Like things like people talk about in my office, like race play or humiliation or being an inanimate object. I mean, there's so many unusual fantasies. So really trying to understand that having erotic compassion, it comes from somewhere, either from my childhood or an experience that I had. A third one that I would want gay men to take away is that it can change, it evolves, and that actually you can not only go from liking daddies and to twinks, but you can also maybe it could expand to liking somebody of a different gender, and you'd be shocked by that if you allow it.
I think that's all great advice. And we're going to dive even further into that last point in the next episode, where we're going to be talking about gay men who sleep with women, which is a conversation that you won't want to miss. So I really appreciate this amazing conversation. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get copies of your books?
Yes, it was a pleasure being here with you too. Yes, you can go to my website, joekort.com, JOEKORT. And then I have my own podcast there. And then my books are on my site. And then it also has links to my social media as well, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook and all that.
Great. Well, I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.